Hello, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Screen. I am JM, and we're going to just sit around and we're going to talk about a ton of fun things today. Behind the Screen is a show, if you're new here, where we just talk about game design and role-playing games and do game reviews, but we take it from a GM, but also a game designer's perspective. I have written and designed several games. I'm working on several more, so I felt like that was an interesting hook. And we're actually talking about two things today. We're going to be talking about the last clinic question that I haven't been able to answer, and then starting off the new series, which is going to be a series about the genres of fantasy. And if we end up liking this, we'll do a genres of science fiction. And we're going to look at the literary influences of that genre, the games that play into that genre, and the mechanical experience that reinforce this gameplay at the table. Rook, good to see you, buddy. And thank you, as always, for your kind and generous heart and nature. So, let's get into it. So the last question was actually from a good friend, Bob Crumb, friend of the show. If you have not checked out our Deadlands game on Monday, go check it out. Last night's game was great. Lots of combat, lots of role-playing moments. Rook wandered off into the mountains to kill someone by himself, and we'll see how that plays out next week. But Bob is on there, and he had a question about romance at the table. And because his character sort of critically fumbled a notice roll and has the trouble magnet, he noticed how beautiful this prisoner was, Scarlet of the Ghost Steel Gang, and perhaps something will develop there. But I figured he asked the question, his character may have a budding romance. It's a good time to talk about it here on the show. Hey, John, good. Yes, best Bob life. To all of our Racine fans, it warms my heart. So I know you would, Rook, and you probably will do it again. I'm surprised it took you so long to chomp at the bait that I kept throwing at you. So romance at the table can be a very tricky thing. Either can come off too cheesy, it can go too far, it can make people uncomfortable. And I think the key marker for doing romance at the table between characters, between NPCs, is number one, comfort level. If anyone seems uncomfortable, just let it fade in the background. Say, okay, hey, we understand there's something going on here. If one player doesn't want to be involved, that is a hard wall, and you put that down. But I think there are ways to, and speak of the devil and his he shall appear, Mr. Bob Crumb in the house. Again, if you haven't checked it out, go to darkpatina.com where Bob's card decks are on sale. You can go back and look at the previous Behind the Screen where I did a show off of the card decks. You do get to be the devil, where last night you just got to play against the devil. And Bob, for you, I did name your personal Manitou after a character from a Clive Barker novel. So, Malian. So, I think the key things are, one, always be aware of the other person's cues. If they're wildly uncomfortable, if there's no reason, if you're wildly uncomfortable as the GM, just let it go. I'll give you the spelling, Bob, here in a bit. So I think in most cases, I've run most of my games in the last decade have involved characters in love, characters with romance, characters getting married. One was RuneQuest, right? RuneQuest, that whole campaign revolved around marriages of alliance, marriages of love, this sort of thing. And what I found is I had basically three spectrums of players. I had the players who were like, intellectually, yes, it makes sense that my character would be attracted to this person. Yes, it makes sense that my character would pursue this person. And that's all that every so often I just want to have that NPC in a scene with me, and it's not going to get mushy. It's not going to get weird. It's just going to I know what you mean, Bob. Uh, they just want that there. I had on the other end of the spectrum, the people who were writing love poetry, love letters to the NPCs, or even um, my RuneQuest game was a weird game. Not in the way Bob was wink wink nudging, but I mean, in RuneQuest, you have high feast days of Earth, which are essentially large orgies. You have um, a lot of like Earth priestesses are, much like Ernalda, they don't see attachment in the same way that sort of our modern worldview does. So they went wholeheartedly into that. And then I had people in the middle who were like, ooh, yeah, how attractive is that person? All right, I take them back to my room. And that was basically the comfort level of our table. Again, number one thing is always play to the comfort level of your table. Romance between PCs is a whole different subject, and I would again default to comfort level. One, if one player's not into it and the other player is pushing, you need to talk with the player who's pushing. That's not okay. We're all here to have fun. We're all here to tell a story. It should be focused. But there are times where the fighter might want to pursue a princess or a prince in order to gain political power and notability. There are times where you're carousing and you just want to like have the at least intellectual experience that said, hey, my character went out and had a good time that night. I think the key, and yeah, John, good point. That's a session zero sort of thing. It also is weird because romance is one of those things that can come up in the middle of a game. You were maybe expecting to run a dungeon delving adventure, but the barmaid in town who the players rescue, maybe the wizard is like, well, we've had some fun interactions. Maybe I will see where this goes. And again, I like Bob, step one, default to your comfort level. If your players want more than what you are comfortable with, again, you are a player at the table and you get to step back. If other people are at the table, again, you can say, hey, we're putting this, we're fading to black here. Let's move on to something else. And if you need to talk with a player, I have had players who want to push this much farther than anyone at the table is comfortable with. And remember, if you talk to that player in private and they keep doing this, you have the right to just uninvite them. All right? There is no rule that says if someone has played in a previous game, they have to play in a new game, or that their behavior is not, their seat at the table is not dependent on their behavior. We have a social contract. Bob, we had this a different situation, but I don't know if you remember when we went from Star Wars to Shadowrun at your house. There was definitely one player that I was like, you don't get to come back. Like, I don't want to run for you. You got to play in Chris's game. You don't get to play in my game. And that's okay. Our good friend Corey used to equate role-playing games to Victorian dance cards. Sometimes you get asked to dance, and you should love that. And there are times where you will show up and you don't get asked to dance, and you need to be okay with it. So, yes, Rook has a completely different... well, I mean, you can have chemistry Rook. You just... eventually the domino falls before... Bum, bum, bum. So anyway, yeah, number one, if you want to include romance, first of all, test the waters. Say, hey, this NPC is seems amiable to this. How do you feel about it? You can do that both meta-wise, where you are like, you specifically go, okay, Bob, you notice this prisoner, and put it in their court. Like, I haven't said anything, like, literally, Leslie's romantic possibility, who he noticed, is in jail. So literally, Leslie can, Bob as a character, can pursue that or not. I have literally isolated this romantic interest. The other thing is, again, play to your player's comfort. That's always something. Like, I realize we have a lot more rules and techniques that have developed over the years. I think partially because the minority of horrible games, once we hit the internet age, we have a way to share about them. But also, as cons, as game store days, as virtual tabletops have exploded, we often find ourselves playing with people we don't know. And what may be comfortable for you is not comfortable for other people. What may be comfortable for other people is not comfortable for you. And so there have been a lot new accretion of rules around different types of games or different themes or safety tools. And I think those are really more for when you are playing with people you don't know very well. Again, I've had a handful of games over the course of my career where either myself or someone else has stepped over a line. And as friends, we were able to go, whew, that was awful. I am very sorry that happened. Let's make sure that doesn't happen again. And they become sort of part of the abstract social contract that you and your game table has. Are there games that arbitrate romance, like rules-wise? Well, I have heard that, is it Strixhaven has new rules for connections for 5th edition. Yeah, Rook and I are on the same page. Games like Blue Rose are very much detailed in the fact that they are sort of swashbuckling romances, romance capital R, but that does include romance little r. Man, all right, this just proves that Phantom Rook and I are great minds because we all are thinking the same thing. I'm pretty sure 7th Sea has some sort of rule in there. And Bob, if you want like mechanical things, I mean, Burning Wheel has several ways for persuading for interacting with people. The other thing, Bob, that if you remember, there were a lot of charms in Exalted that dealt with the social and romantic sphere. Now, again, play to your own table. Because some of those charms could be taken either as they are written or in a very sort of weird, as Bob put, way. So again, in general, kind of summarizing everything I've just talked about, if it starts developing, find a way to throw it into your PC's corner and leave it there. If they don't want to pick it up, do not pick it up. And yes, that's another great point there. Welcome to the chat. I'm going to attempt Sin Saber. Yeah, I am a big fan of showing players and not telling players. So if you include romantic NPCs, you're going to show how things could possibly work. It's like in RuneQuest when I talked about the fact that there's ransom. I didn't tell my players, hey, you could give up here. I included NPCs giving up in fights and ransoming themselves back. So it gets in the player's head, hey, I can see that. They don't necessarily need to do anything with it. If you show NPC romance, if you put an NPC romantic interest, and again, allow the player to engage with it, then you're playing to their comfort level, which I always think is sort of a best case practice. So, Bob, hopefully that answers some ways that you can include romance. I do think putting things like romance in a game does add layers of verisimilitude. If you have that one player, and I have that one player, I have had that one player who always makes it weird. Always. If you're watching, you know who I'm talking about because you and I have had multiple conversations about this. I'm not going to name names, but I finally was just like, cool, you don't get to do this anymore in my games. And we had a talk about it. I explained the fact that the rest of the table, including myself, is always uncomfortable with how they portray this, and that it's not a healthy behavior at my game table. And they've understood. They don't do that anymore. But hopefully that is a way to like kind of provide some framework. I'm always weird about mechanical interactions for social, like organic growth, like we'd have, for like a mechanical romance effect. But I think an easy way to do that is maybe create a wooing skill challenge, where if this NPC really, or this PC really wants to pursue this other character, and it's not player to player, but let's go back to my the fighter who is attempting to woo the prince. Maybe you say, cool, they're going to be, you have to make 5 persuasion checks. I'll give you advantage if you find good gifts, and the DCs are going to continue to increase because, right, it's very easy to step into the first circle of friendship, but it gets progressively harder as you are trying to focus your attention. So, yes. Hey, Bob, thanks for cheering. Yes, for not weird romance and for just regular romance. So you could always create a 3, 5, or 7. Those are kind of my base defaults for things like this. Yes, Monster Hearts is all about high school romance. So that's powered by the Apocalypse game, if I'm not mistaken, John. But yeah, Bob, you could create a little track and just check off and say, hey, when they get to these levels, here's kind of how the relationship would be defined, at least by the other person. And that could create both a mechanical interaction for the player, but also hey, no, you haven't got exclusive with this person. You don't get to do X, Y, or Z, or say X, Y, or Z to say something like that. So that is, I do know a lot of games, Bob. Some people have a lot of whiskey. Right? No, that's not a good example. I have a lot of whiskey. Some people collect baseball cards. I collect role-playing games. All right, so that ends the first half of the show where we're talking about romance. Bob, I hope that was helpful. I always hope that was helpful for everybody. If you like what we said about romance, leave a little comment down below, comment in the chat. If you have other ideas or know of other mechanical systems that sort of reinforce that or are helpful for that, I would greatly appreciate learning about them. So we're going to start a new series possibly this week, possibly next week. Yes, Phantom of Truth, every time someone says, as you wish, my son Zane goes, oh, they really mean they love you. I'm like, not always, but, 10 points to Hufflepuff for remembering that. Thanks, John. So the reason I say it may be actually starting next week is I have a ton of Savage Pathfinder coming in today, according to my mail app. And if that's the case, I would love to do an unboxing of Savage Pathfinder and Savage and the Rise of the Rune Lords that they did. Also, in case you are interested at all, there is a Kickstarter going live. It may be live today. He said, why not just taking time to look this up with you guys? Let's just go to Kickstarter right now and see if the new Pinnacle Kickstarter has gone live. They're doing Kickstarter for the Advanced Player's Guide and for the Curse of the Crimson Throne. And so if those are live, we'll just shout out for that. I'll look that up later and let you know that on Thursday. But yeah, so we'll either start that this week or next week. Becca and JD, thank you. Yeah, there are a lot of romances in Fading Suns. Becca's character had several romantic interests. Captain Calypso and Gregor, very developed. I think they did really well it, like how it developed and very organically. There was a little bit of flirting between Gemma and uh, the other saint that she encountered, and I'm trying to think. I don't think that Perpetua found anyone interesting, which is totally fine. Uh, just the way it goes. So, yes. All right. So, what are we going to talk about for the rest of today? I'm looking up this Savage Worlds thing. Um, we're going to look at starting a new series on fantasy as a genre, the different types of fantasy, the books that inspired that genre, and what games best exemplify and help you replicate that experience at the table. So, it does not look like it is up yet. So essentially what we're going to look at, we're going to look at some literary history, we're going to look at some different games from across the history of role-playing games. And we are going to look at, oh, Bob, I love Amber as a series of novels by Roger Zelazny. I've played Amber. I've run Amber twice, and it is a diceless role-playing system. And when we get there, I promise to give you all of my feedback on that. Now, I will say, everything in here is going to be my opinion. I am drawing from places like TV Tropes. I'm drawing from Stephen Long's work in Fantasy Hero to kind of establish some genres. We may split hairs on a couple of things. We may say, well, JM, is Conan low fantasy? Is it sword and sorcery? What's the difference between low fantasy and sword and sorcery? That's totally fine. We can disagree on that. It's okay to disagree on that. We'll be splitting hairs at this point. But the reason we're starting with fantasy is, gall darn it, fantasy is the most pervasive type of role-playing game in the market today. It is, I mean, there's a reason that they call it producing a fantasy heartbreaker, right? It's another fantasy game. Every year, another fantasy game comes out. Free League, who, I've got the Forbidden Lands stuff right up here. They produce a ton of great games. They've got, just one company has Forbidden Lands, and they have the One Ring, and they do Symbaroum, and they do Ruins of Symbaroum. So there's 4 different fantasy games just from one company. Jackals would be definitely in the sword and sorcery genre. It's one of the problems I have. Like, I really love the look of the new Conan books in the 2D20 system. I just adore it. But every time I look at running Conan, I actually get inspired to run Jackals. And Bob, we need to make that happen. Like, we definitely need to make some Jackals happen for you. Perhaps after our Deadlands game. So that's kind of the format. We're gonna tackle a genre of fantasy, and it's probably gonna be 2 to 3 episodes per genre. We're gonna tackle a genre. We're gonna talk about the literary high points, interacting with you guys. You guys just let me know the genre, the style of, or the authors that you enjoy in this genre. And then we'll talk about what is the core experience there and what role-playing games kind of mechanically reward you for playing in that core experience. So that's sort of what this look is going to be. And so when I look at fantasy, I really see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different genres of fantasy that I enjoy. I have referenced on my shelf. And we're gonna cover that. We're gonna define our terms. We put our syllabus together. We're gonna define our terms today, and then either Thursday or next Tuesday, we're gonna jump into the first one. So how I would define these different genres of fantasy. We're gonna start with, depending on who you ask, it's either heroic fantasy or epic fantasy. The exemplars of this would be things like Tolkien. We'll just start there. Tolkien, Robert Jordan, Dragonlance. There we go. There's another great one. Again, I haven't prepared my notes for the next episode. I just have my notes for this episode. And what exemplifies heroic or epic fantasy is this very black and white morality. It is usually quest-driven, good guys versus the bad guys. Fellowship versus the Nine Riders, the dragon versus the dark one, and it is driven by these very grand, romantic, monumental stories of the hero's struggle to set the world aright. I refer to it as I've always referred to it as heroic fantasy because epic fantasy to me strays more into the high fantasy genre, but we can talk about that later. So epic fantasies we're going to start with looking at things like Dragonlance and Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time and David Eddings' The Belgariad, things like that, and obviously The Lord of the Rings. What games do the genre well? What would we want to see in that genre? And how do we build that experience both for ourselves as GMs and our tables as players? Now, then there's high fantasy. So high fantasy is actually what I would also refer to as Gygaxian fantasy. Gygaxian fantasy is now its own thing. So think Forgotten Realms, where there's just magic everywhere. There are dozens of magical empires just sort of lying about the place. Ooh, no, John, actually, that was a great joke. Not epic fantasy, but epoch fantasy. Really, if you haven't read Nature of Middle-earth, total side tangent here. The Nature of Middle-earth, the reason that there are ages in Middle-earth is because they really do map to the ages as, the Catholic Church sort of outlines them. And when we get to that, I'll go back and look at how those ages map out. But basically, if I remember correctly, it's like Adam to the Flood. Adam to the Flood, I think, is the second age. And the Flood to David. I'll have to look at this. Like, he actually mapped them out because in Catholic liturgy, you talk about the ages of the world. And Tolkien was sort of mapping those ages out in the West, as opposed to the church was obviously focused on the Semitic tradition there. Can I plan out far enough to get a reading list for people to be ready for class? Yes, Bob. If you are a member of the Iconic Patronage, I will put together a list here on the Iconic Discord and put the list up, hopefully, at least a couple of days in advance so people can be familiar. Yes, Rook, R.A. Salvatore, the people who are writing, who wrote the Avatar trilogy, or series, I think it's more than a trilogy, in Forgotten Realms. We have things like D&D is now, like, first and second edition D&D were very much, I would say, more focused on the heroic or epic fantasy. And as we got to the middle of 2E and moved into 3E, we are definitely now more into the high fantasy. Thanks, John. Always enjoy a reminder of where I'm at. There are times where I do not circle back around to where I was at. So these are dominated by large and very powerful magic users. Another one that I really like is the Malazan Books of the Fallen. Very high fantasy. Things like we've talked about R. Scott Baker. I would put that more in the epic fantasy or the high fantasy than the epic fantasy in certain parts. And that's the thing. These things can get a little fuzzy. Lord Dunsany wrote a lot of high fantasy. Rook, I mean, 4th edition is also like super high fantasy. I would argue that what's interesting about 3rd edition and Pathfinder, and maybe even 5th edition to a degree, there are these delineations as you go up that, like, right, 1 to 5, 1 to 9 is sort of more of the heroic fantasy, and then you move into the high fantasy as you move up. Now, there are things like low fantasy. So low fantasy is a strange new world, and magic is very rare, if not non-existent. Actually, I would put Thieves' World in the high fantasy genre, which may be weird. But here's the thing. Every story has magic in it. It's not like magic is super rare. You get the feeling that it's rare, but when you actually do a deep dive into Thieves' World, It's everywhere. Golarion is another good high fantasy. So low fantasy. Lankmar, Fafhrd and Grey Mouser is very low fantasy. Some people could argue that Conan is low fantasy, but definitely also fits more in the sword and sorcery genre. Books of the New Sun, which is technically science fantasy. Jack, you know, by not Jack Vance, Gene Wolfe. George R. R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire. Yes, Joe Abercrombie's first Law series is sort of peak low fantasy for me. Old Dark Sun, second edition Dark Sun, also a great touchstone for these things. Then you have sword and sorcery, and Conan is our example. The difference between sword and sorcery and low fantasy is that magic is very present, but magic is also mostly only used by the bad guys, right? The heroes of a sword and sorcery tale use blade and muscle and cunning to overcome their sorceress, who are usually very powerful adversaries. There's some good Clark Ashton Smith stories that fall into sword and sorcery. Some of the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories fall into this genre. Depending on what time frame you are reading anything of Michael Moorcock in, you're either going to hit high fantasy, low fantasy, or sword and sorcery. Elric, Corum, Hawkmoon, the Eternal Champion. These are all different styles of this. And the last one I'm probably going to talk about, because I have not seen, I'm gonna cheer Bob on for a second. I have not seen this done very well in a role-playing game, but I've seen it done well in a session, which is Crossworlds Fantasy. Crossworlds Fantasy are going to be things like Thomas Covenant, The Chronicles of Narnia, Guy wrote a book. I forget the name of it. This is why we'll put the reading list together. But where somebody from our world, Three Hearts, Three Lions, is pulled into a fantasy world. And so part of the joy of those books is learning how the new world works, exploring the magic, discovering what the rules are, what the nature of the world is. And usually you bounce back and forth, and sometimes there are time jumps between the two. Is it Finnovar? Is that Guy K. Caravel's? Yeah, the Tap Finnovar is another good one like that. The Unepic video game. I have not actually played that one, John. Is that on console or PC? All right, let's go to Gygaxian Fantasy. Let's dig into that. Orth and Greyhawk are definitely that. Yeah, I think so. For me, Gygaxian Fantasy is this idea that, right, because as Phantom pointed out, Orth and which is the Greyhawk world, and started off very sort of low fantasy, heroic fantasy, and the fact that magic was there, but it was very sort of, at least originally, a little bit rarer, and it kind of grew as Greyhawk developed and D&D became more codified. But if you go back and look at the original Forgotten Realms first edition box set, it does still feel very Gygaxian fantasy in the fact that, right, I heard this story. I'm hoping this is true as I relate it. It was related to me as a true story, so either we're just going to continue propagating the legend, or there may be a kernel of truth here. Is that, you can see Ed Greenwood was writing Forgotten Realms stories because his dad had given him things like Conan and Elric, and when he asked for more, he was like, there's no more, go write your own stuff. And then you start adding he found D&D and started running games in his Forgotten Realms. That's why it's called the Forgotten Realms. It was sort of set in a Conan-esque kind of prehistory and then developed into its own thing. So, Vancian magic is a deep part of the Gygaxian experience. But I think Gygax created something pretty unique in the fantasy genre. That's sort of a blend of a lot of things. You have Vancian magic. You have heroic sort of views of, right? The reason that I would say modern D&D is more high fantasy as opposed to heroic fantasy is some of the mechanical touchstones that have gotten removed from the game remove the high fantasy, or sorry, the heroic fantasy elements. When it was originally made, alignment was core to the D&D experience because it established this heroic fantasy dichotomy and ontological reality of the world. We sort of moved away from that game design wise, and so we've sort of left some of the heroic fantasy elements behind into, kind of becoming this more epic, sorry, no, not epic, get my terms right, high fantasy feel. We'll probably talk about Jack Vance when we do our look at high fantasy as well. Maybe touch a little on science fantasy. So here's the problem with trying to define these things. You could argue, and I would delight in arguing with you about this. Oh, well, JM, this book actually falls on this side of the line as opposed to this side of the line. Fantasy genres are really more like Venn diagrams. Everybody, when you're writing or playing in a game, you're trying to capture a certain feel, and you're not really concerned with the genres. The genres are sort of a meta text that we apply to the things that we love to try and categorize them, because we like categories. We like well-defined. Yes, Vecna is an anagram of Vance, and my favorite one of these Phantom is that Melth, creator of Melth's Magic Arrow, literally stood for male elf. When they asked the person his character name, he had written M under sex and elf under race, and he looked at his character sheet and went, his name's Melth. Also, Jim Ward's name backwards is one of the main mages who created spells in the original D&D, which is just beautiful. I love that. Zane actually, I was telling him these stories, and now he plays a character named Enaz because he thinks it's so cool that he can just come up with a character name that is reversed of his own name, and he loves it. So, we've gone a little long. Sorry about that. Talking about romance, talking about kind of the foundational principles for this new thing that we're going to be going into. So I believe Thursday we're going to do an unboxing of the Pathfinder, Savage Worlds Pathfinder material. I will put books in the Discord server under the behind the screen sub-channel so that people can prepare for, hey, here's the books that James is going to be talking about as it relates to this one specific type of fantasy. And we'll be starting that on Tuesday. Yes! So, everyone, thank you all for showing up. This has been great. John, is good to see you. Phantom, Rook, Bob, Becca, JD, everybody who was in the chat who commented. It was great to talk with you. And okay, hold on. We had a new person. And to Sin Saber OG, thank you for joining us. And we will be back on Thursday with more behind the screens. We're going to look at Savage Worlds Pathfinder. I'm going to talk about it. I've been reading through it. I'm very excited about this product. Not just because I enjoy running Deadlands, but because I think Savage Worlds is a very fun and fast and exciting way to play. If you did not tune in last night, it's live on YouTube today. Go check out our last night Deadlands episode. You got to see combat. You got to see magic, how magic works in Savage Worlds, and most importantly, you got to see how the hucksters work. When Bob played 2 games of cards against the Manitou that he draws his power from, and won both hands. So I'm hoping that we can just keep pushing Bob until he fails at one of these rolls, and then we will see what happens. So everyone, thank you so much. We will be playing Torg tonight at 7:30, starting off the new arc of the Infernus Gamble. We did our intro last week. Going to get into the meat of it tonight. We'll be back on Tuesday with more behind the screen on Thursday, and then this Saturday we're going to be doing our next episode of the Grand Campaign. So, you did sign up for a book club by being here. Surprise. That is, you know what? That's the best part. Surprise book club. So, until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, stay gaming. I will see you all on Thursday, or tonight if you jump in for Torg, but Thursday for more behind the screen. Have a good one.